Adolf Hitler was a fanatical leader, a megalomaniac who led his country and many others into the abyss.
Some historians believe that Adolf Hitler thought that his mission in life was to rid the world of Jews. That even if he didn't build the Third Reich for 1,000 years, he would be celebrating for eliminating the Jewish population from the world. I don't know how you begin to deal with that kind of madness, but that's who he was.
Adolf Hitler was born in Braunau am Inn, Austria, on April 20th, 1889. Hitler's childhood was an uneasy one. His father died when he was very young, and he was not a good student.
In his teen years, in his pre-war Viennese life, you start seeing the attractions to the anti-Semitic and rabid anti-Bolshevik attitudes.
His name was not Adolf Hitler, it was Schnickelberger, and he was a corporal in World War I. But suddenly he was the man who was giving voice to a long history of German pride. The consequences of World War I for Germany were extraordinary. I mean, the victors, the Western Alliance, placed such penalties on them that they could barely survive. And so they were open to the idea of someone like Hitler who could give voice to their most base fears, and he very cannily knew just how to do that.
Hitler, very quickly after the World War I, began to engage in political activity, joining and helping start the German Workers' Party in 1919.
This party later became the Nazi Party.
In 1923, Adolf Hitler conspired with other right-wing politicians to overthrow the Republic.
In response to this, Hitler was sentenced to prison, where he wrote Mein Kampf, expressing his radical, rabid beliefs.
He was irrationally anti-Semitic, and he was able to use anti-Semitism as a tool for his rise to power.
Nazi Germany carried out a campaign to cleanse German society of individuals viewed as biological threats to the nation's health from 1933 to 1945. The purists of the German society were known as the Aryan race. These Nazis developed racial health policies that began with the mass sterilization of the genetically diseased. The Nazi regime carried out a program of approximately 400,000 forced sterilizations and over 275,000 euthanasia deaths that found its most radical manifestation in the death of millions of racial enemies in what would be known as the Holocaust. In September 1939, the German invasion of Poland both set this quest for race and space into motion and began World War II in Europe. The National Socialists saw themselves as a revolutionary movement, and their goal was a radical reshaping of existing society into a racially homogeneous Aryan national community. The racial homogeneity they desired could only be created negatively through discrimination, exclusion, and eradication, and ultimately by killing those who did not fit their perfect Aryan society requirements. The weak, sick, or homosexual would often be considered the discriminate, and those who did not belong to the German race, unwelcome the most, were Jews, considered to be the chief enemy of Germany.
Most people would agree that evil should be stopped, by force of arms if necessary. But how do you know when a resort to war is justified? I'm Jim Lindsay, and this is Lessons Learned. Our topic today is Adolf Hitler's announcement on March 16, 1935, that he was rearming Germany. Hitler was named Chancellor of Germany on January 30, 1933. Within a week, he told German military leaders that his ultimate foreign policy goal was to conquer lands to Germany's east and to seek their ruthless Germanization. One thing, however, stood in Hitler's way: Germany's military weakness. The victors of the First World War had written the Treaty of Versailles to keep Germany from threatening the rest of Europe ever again. Among other things, Germany could have no more than 100,000 troops. The size of its navy was limited, and the treaty barred Germany from having an air force. None of that mattered to Hitler. Soon after consolidating his power at home, he moved to rebuild the German military. He ordered the creation of the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force. He also launched plans to create an army 3 times larger than what the Versailles Treaty allowed. Initially, however, Hitler kept these decisions secret. In public, he proclaimed Germany's peaceful intentions and its commitment to honor its international obligations. All that changed on March 16, 1935. Hitler announced that Germany was reintroducing a military draft with the goal of creating an army of more than 500,000 soldiers. He also confirmed what had long been rumored, that the Luftwaffe had 800 planes. Hitler made his announcement based on a simple calculation, that the other European powers would grumble, but they wouldn't go to war to preserve the terms of the Treaty of Versailles. He was right. Britain, France, Italy, and the League of Nations all condemned Germany's rearmament, but they did nothing to make Hitler pay a price.
The political police of Nazi Germany were called the Gestapo. The Gestapo ruthlessly eliminated opposition to the Nazis within Germany in occupied territories and, in partnership with the security service, was responsible for the roundup of Jews throughout Europe for deportation to extermination camps. They were a vital component in both Nazi repression and the Holocaust. It was a police force unlike others, in that it did not answer to any judicial or legal oversight. Without fear of civilian repercussions, the Gestapo used ruthless methods to identify and arrest political opponents and others who refused to conform to the police of the Nazi regime. The Gestapo had relatively few officers and relied heavily on denunciation and cooperation from members of the public. The Gestapo were officially established in April 1933 in Prussia by Heinrich Himmler as its chief, and it was his national agency. In 1944, the Gestapo employed 32,000 people, but only 18,000 were actually involved in the policing. The Gestapo operated outside of the judicial review to repress any legal activity considered unacceptable by the party. One of the Gestapo's first tasks was to target mainly political enemies of the Nazis, such as communists, social democrats, liberals, and other targets, but not initially the Jews. One of the most effective weapons of the Gestapo was protective custody. This is where enemies of the state were so hated, the Nazis decided it was necessary to separate them in protective custody to protect them from the righteous anger of good German citizens. This twisted logic allowed the Gestapo full power to arrest individuals and hold them in concentration camps indefinitely, without ever charging them or giving them a judicial hearing. By the end of the summer of 1933, an estimated 100,000 Germans have been imprisoned at some point, and between 500 through 600 had been killed.
In the summer of 1941, Hitler went on the offense and decided to invade the Soviet Union under Operation Barbarossa. He sent 3 armies into Russia, one north to Leningrad, the second straight to Moscow, and a third south to Stalingrad. The Nazis had a hard time holding their own against strong Soviet resistance, the harshness of a Russian winter. Operation Barbarossa shifted its goal. Hitler decided to focus on the southern city of Stalingrad, which had rich oil fields in the Caucasus region of Russia. The Battle of Stalingrad was a fierce battle fought in close quarters in the city. The Nazi troops pushed on, attempting to take the city block by block, fighting from bombed-out house to bombed-out house, rubble and debris everywhere. Eventually, the Soviets were able to flank the German army on both sides, cut them off, trapping them in Stalingrad. Although the Nazi troops were surrounded, Hitler refused to let his troops retreat. But eventually, on January 31st, 1943, after facing starvation and frostbite, the tired troops surrendered. The Axis powers suffered about 960,000 casualties and lost 900 aircrafts, 500 tanks, and 6,000 artillery pieces during the 6-month campaign for Stalingrad. The USSR suffered 1,129,619 casualties, lost 4,301 tanks, 15,728 artillery pieces, and 2,769 combat aircraft. The leaders of the Allied nations argued over the various steps needed to be taken to bring the war to an end. In November 1943, the Big Three traveled to Tehran, Iran, to discuss what needed to be done. Stalin argued for the need of a second front being opened in France to relieve some of the pressure off of the Soviet Union, whereas Churchill feared another Battle of Somme scenario occurring on the Western Front like in World War I, and German U-boats in the English Channel. Eventually, they all came to an agreement, and Operation Overlord was born. General Dwight D. Eisenhower served as Supreme Commander of Operation Overlord and planned to land 21 American divisions and 26 British, Canadian, and Polish divisions over a 50-mile stretch of various beaches in Normandy. General Bernard Montgomery was the commander of the ground forces, and General Bradley led the United States First Army. According to the plan on paper, the Allies would be striking 5 beaches: Utah, Omaha, Juneau, Gold, and Sword, and set up a fake headquarters in the southeast across the English Channel from Calais that was equipped with wooden boats and cardboard tanks and useless ships to throw off the German army and trick them into thinking the Allies would attack the Axis at Calais, whereas the Allies would attack at Normandy. On June 6, 1944, more than 11,000 planes led the way and destroyed German communication, and at 6:03 a.m., the Allied troops landed at Normandy. 4 of the beaches faced slight resistance and had relatively low casualties, but at Omaha Beach, the Germans dug a trench on the cliffs overlooking the beach and built pillbox structures with heavy artillery mounted above and had the beach covered. Of course, the American armies were the ones taking on Omaha Beach, and they fought fiercely. The Allies pushed through and took the beach at Normandy, and after the battle was won, the Allies landed more than 1 million troops at Normandy. After taking Normandy, the Allies pushed all the way through to Paris, and eventually all the way to Berlin. In December 1944, after D-Day, Hitler was desperate for a counterattack against the Allies. At this time, the Allied troops were spread out between the English Channel and the Alps, and the German forces were heavily massed near the Ardennes forest. Hitler's plan was to have English-speaking German soldiers wearing American uniforms cut telephone lines, change road signs, and spread confusion. Then German tanks secured communication and transport hubs, broke through the forests of Ardennes, and pushed back the Allied lines to the town of Bagstone. This created a bulge in the Allied lines, and the Nazis captured several towns. On top of all of this, heavy snowfall prevented the Allies from receiving aid from the skies. This took the Allies by surprise, but American forces held despite frostbite and brutal German assault. Things turned around on December 23rd when the skies cleared and the Allies bombed the Germans and were able to steadily push the Germans out of France. The Battle of the Bulge was the last major German offensive on the Western Front in World War II, and crippled German reserves, demoralized the troops, and shortened Hitler's time left in charge.
The 1941 bombing of Pearl Harbor by the Japanese was one of the most devastating attacks on American soil. But just a few decades earlier, Japan and the United States were allies in World War I. So how did things get so bad between them? It all comes down to oil. To explain, we need to go all the way back to the 19th century. Once an isolated nation, Japan underwent a makeover of sorts to compete with the West. Known as the Meiji Restoration, it embraced industrialization, built up its military, and restored Japan's emperor as the powerful head of state. Aided by 2 successful wars, Japan aggressively expanded its empire. The Japanese were becoming an imperial superpower, until the Great Depression hit. You see, Japan is an island nation with few natural resources, so it depends on international trade to keep its economy afloat. The economic crisis put a stop to all that. Japan was in a bind, so its military leaders, who called the shots at this point, decided the best defense against financial ruin would be a good offense. They would invade nearby China, particularly Manchuria, for its plentiful resources like iron, soybeans, and land. Lots and lots of unsettled land. So what does this all have to do with the United States? Well, the U.S. was a long-standing Chinese ally, and it watched uneasily from the sidelines as the 2 nations clashed in the 1930s. But America wanted nothing to do with another war, so it just denounced Japan's aggression. Tensions rose in 1937 when Japan invaded the Chinese city of Nanjing. In doing so, they attacked an American gunboat, killing 3 and wounding dozens. Disturbing images coming out of war-torn China further swayed American opinion against Japan. In response, America attacked Japan's resources. They imposed economic sanctions of aircraft, scrap metal, and other items crucial to Japan's military. The U.S. hoped the sanctions would stop Japanese expansion, But Japan doubled down, invading French Indochina in 1940 and then teaming up with Germany and Italy. Why those two countries? Because like Japan, they were controlled by militaristic governments, obsessed with conquest and driven by a deep sense of nationalism. The final straw came in July of 1941, when President Franklin D. Roosevelt announced a trade embargo on oil. An oil shortage was an absolute disaster for Japan, who relied on imports for 90% of its supply. Not only would this destroy the Japanese economy, but it would put its military at a literal standstill, which meant no more expansion. Japan resented the US for meddling in its quest to dominate Asia. The only solution left for the Japanese was total war. Crush the US fleet in the Pacific and then occupy Southeast Asia and claim its resources. And so, on December 7, 1941, Japan launched its surprise attack at Pearl Harbor. At first, it seemed like a win for the Japanese, destroying or damaging 21 US ships and more than 300 aircraft, and killing around 2,400 soldiers, sailors, airmen, and civilians. But the success was short-lived. The United States declared war on Japan on December 8, 1941. Not long after, the Japanese would realize the mistake it made at Pearl Harbor. Their bombers had failed to deliver a mortal blow to the Pacific Fleet, missing oil tanks, ammunition sites, repair facilities, and aircraft carriers.
Following the attack on the Hawaiian naval base Pearl Harbor, the United States would soon declare a war against Imperial Japan and align themselves with the Allied forces. Even though the Allies were more focused on defeating Hitler and Mussolini in Europe first, America would not let Tojo and Japan go without retaliation for their attack on the United States. Relieving Ernest J. King from his duties, a man named Chester W. Nimitz would take over the role as Fleet Admiral in the United States Navy. His actions while in command would change the tide in the war for the Pacific. With his cunning tactics and broad intelligence, Nimitz would find himself written into the pages of history, most famously for his role in the Battle for Midway. In Washington, D.C., rumors and arguments were circulating about where the Japanese were planning their next attack, debating between Ports Moresby or the Aleutians, a series of islands off the coast of Alaska. Rear Admiral Edwin Layton had other suspicions, though. With the assistance from both Admiral Agnes Driscoll and colleague Joseph J. Rochefort, Layton and the Navy were able to both intercept and translate the Japanese code with ease, revealing that the next target in the eyes of Imperial Japan would be AF, better known as Midway. Deploying the USS Yorktown, Enterprise, Hornet, and Hammond to Midway, Nimitz would surprise the Japanese Navy with a sudden presence in the Pacific. Undeterred with the arrival of the American forces, Yamamoto would order the attack to continue as planned. And on June 4th, 1942, the Battle of Midway would officially begin. And on June 6, 1942, the Battle of Midway would draw to a closure and reveal itself to be American victory, thanks to pilots such as Wade McCluskey and Richard Best. Japan would suffer a heavy blow, not only losing 3,057 Japanese sailors, but also losing the Akagi, Kaga, Soru, and Hiru carriers as well. America would not go out without a scratch as well, as they had lost Yorktown and around 307 Americans. Despite all their losses, the American victory would provide a massive change in the movements of the Japanese. Instead of continuing to push forwards for Pacific domination, Japan would find themselves creeping backwards, back towards their homeland and Tojo.
This is Staff Sergeant Alvin Josephi Jr., a United States Marine Corps combat correspondent speaking from Iwo Jima. An attack is underway, and so far this morning, in a couple of hours, they have gone approximately 500 yards through the most difficult kind of terrain. This island is studded with pillboxes, and they have already passed through several lanes of them and have passed over the volcanic ash, the terrible yellow, craggy, rocky, lifeless soil of this part of the island. Whoops, some bullets are whistling past us. We are in the open. Japanese mortars and also small arm fire are occasionally dropping around us. This is very near the front, and there is quite a bit of fire going on around here. The roar you hear in the background, our planes are coming from our own planes that are assisting the infantry just up ahead of us. It is a tremendously well-fortified island. I compare it to the Siegfried Line or one of those fortified lines in Europe, except that this is the entire island studded with such a line. Well, this is a moment at Iwo Jima. It is what the men are living under in their foxholes here. When you go to bed in your foxhole at night, you lie awake usually for hours listening to this. Now, this is Staff Sergeant Alvin Josephi Jr. concluding this broadcast from Iwo Jima.
With the war in Europe officially over, many of the soldiers would finally be able to rest and reunite with lost flames, but not for long. Japan remained unhinged in the Pacific, becoming more ravenous and aggressive with their prisoners of war and training as the battle continued to draw closer to their home. Much earlier in the war, two refugees from Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy collaborated on a letter with an idea to end the war for good, a creation of the atomic weapon. Albert Einstein and Enrico Fermi addressed their letter to the late President Roosevelt. In their letter, Einstein and Fermi explained the process of dividing a nucleus to create energy, later being called nuclear fission. Einstein would reject an offer to join the team of scientists, but Fermi would accept. Unfortunately, Roosevelt would be unable to see the project come to life, having passed away in April of 1945. In his place, Harry S. Truman would oversee what would later be known as the Manhattan Project. Taking the place of Einstein, Truman asked scientist J. Robert Oppenheimer to take his place, tasked with the assignment to put the puzzle pieces of the atomic bomb together. U.S. Army Colonel Leslie R. Groves was tasked with finding a building for the tests and security measures. On the morning of July 16, 1945, precisely 5:30 in the morning, in Alamogordo, New Mexico, Trinity would be launched, the code name for the first official testing of their atomic bomb. And once the Manhattan Project was a proven success, that the atomic bomb was able to be manufactured and detonated with positive results, the creation of more atomic bombs would follow. The two most famous ones would be set for Japan, Little Boy and Fat Man.